Tonight, I am going to tell you a very famous story from Thailand. This story was recommended to me by a viewer who grew up hearing it, and the second I started looking into the details of this case, I knew that I had to share it with all of you. It is a story that has been passed down for generations, but when you look at the actual historical accounts and the real locations involved, it becomes something much more than just a simple legend. It is a story about a love so powerful that not even death itself could put an end to it, but it is also a story about a terrifying secret that was hidden right in plain sight. And to really understand this story, we have to go all the way back to the early 1850s. At this time, Thailand was a very different place. In the rural community of Praanong, which was located just southeast of the capital city of Bangkok, life was completely centered around the water. There were no paved roads or modern streets. Instead, the entire community was connected by a massive network of canals. People did not drive carriages or walk long distances. They rowed small wooden boats through these winding waterways to get everywhere they needed to go. It was a very quiet, very isolated way of life, surrounded by thick, dense forests and endless groves of lime trees. In this small, peaceful community lived a young couple who were deeply in love. Their names were Mak and May Nok. Mak was a strong, hard-working young man who spent his days doing physical labor, and May Nok was a beautiful, gentle young woman who was completely dedicated to her husband. They had recently gotten married and had built a small wooden house together. This house was raised up on tall wooden stilts right on the edge of the canal, which was the traditional way to build homes in that area to protect them from seasonal flooding. The house had a large balcony that overlooked the water, where they would sit together in the evenings, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was a very secluded place, located at least a mile away from their nearest neighbors. For Mak and May Nok, this isolation was perfect. They did not need a busy social life. They only needed each other. And then, just a few months into their marriage, they received the best news they could have hoped for. May Nok was pregnant. They were going to start a family, and Mak was absolutely thrilled at the prospect of becoming a father. He immediately began making plans for their future, working even harder to make sure their home was ready for the arrival of their first child. But just as their lives seemed to be absolutely perfect, disaster struck. One morning, government officials arrived in the village of Praanong. They were there to enforce a military draft. At the time, Thailand was locked in a brutal, ongoing war with the neighboring country of Burma. The military was desperately running out of soldiers, and they were forcibly conscripting young men from every rural village across the country. Mak was one of the first young men in Praanong to be selected. He was given no choice in the matter. He was told that he had to pack his bags and report for duty immediately. This news was absolutely devastating for the young couple. May Nok was only a couple of months pregnant at the time, and the thought of her husband leaving for a dangerous war was too much to bear. She wept and begged the officials to let Mak stay, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Mak was forced to say an incredibly painful goodbye to his young pregnant wife, knowing that she would have to go through the rest of her pregnancy and the entire process of giving birth completely on her own. He promised her that he would do everything in his power to survive the war and return to her as quickly as possible. And with that, he was marched away, leaving May Nok standing alone on the wooden dock of their home. Once Mak was gone, he entered a world of complete chaos. In the 1850s, fighting in a war was incredibly brutal. Mak was sent to the front lines, where he faced constant danger, terrible weather, and rampant disease. But what made the experience even worse was the complete lack of communication. In those days in rural Thailand, there were no postal services or phones. Once a soldier left for the war, they were essentially cut off from the rest of the world. Mak had absolutely no way to send a letter to May Nok, and she had no way to send one to him. For nearly an entire year, Mak had zero contact with his wife. He had no idea if she was healthy, if she had enough food, or if she had safely given birth to their child. The agonizing worry was almost as bad as the physical warfare, and then, during a particularly fierce battle, Mak was seriously wounded. He was hit by shrapnel and suffered deep injuries that nearly cost him his life. He was evacuated from the front lines and placed in a crowded, chaotic military hospital far away from his home. The conditions in the hospital were terrible, and Mak spent several agonizing months drifting in and out of consciousness, battling severe fevers and infections. There were many times when the doctors believed he would not survive, but through it all, the only thing that kept Mak fighting to stay alive was the image of his wife and his unborn child. He refused to die in that hospital bed. He had to make it back to Praanong. His hospital bed was located in a giant open-air wooden ward surrounded by dozens of other screaming, groaning soldiers who had also been maimed in the fighting. The air was always heavy with the smell of iron, sweat, and cheap antiseptics. There were no clean sheets, no quiet rooms, and no comfort of any kind. Mak lay there on his back for weeks on end, staring up at the thatched roof of the medical ward, listening to the rain beat down outside. In his most feverish moments, when his body temperature would spike to dangerous levels and the doctors would place cool, damp cloths on his forehead, Mak would hallucinate. He would see May Nok standing at the foot of his bed, holding out her hand to him. She would always smile at him and tell him that he had to stay strong, that he had to survive, because she and their child were waiting for him. These hallucinations were so vivid, so incredibly lifelike, that Mock would wake up reaching out into the empty air, calling her name. It was this absolute determination, this desperate need to see his family again, that allowed him to make a full recovery when so many other wounded soldiers in the ward succumbed to their infections and passed away. By the time his fever finally broke and his wounds began to close, Mock had lost a significant amount of weight and his skin was pale and hollow. But his spirit was completely unbroken. After months of slow and painful recovery, Mock was finally deemed well enough to be discharged from the military. He was weak and still carrying the physical scars of his injuries, but he did not care. He immediately set off on the long journey back to his village. And so, on a warm morning in the early 1850s, Mock found himself back in the canal system of Praanong. He had managed to get a small wooden boat, and he was rowing as fast as his recovering body would allow. The wooden oars splashed rhythmically into the water, and sweat dripped down his face, but he barely noticed the physical exertion. All he could think about was getting home. He had been gone for almost an entire year, and the anticipation was eating him alive. As he rowed deeper into the familiar waterways, the dense forest and lime trees came into view. And then, finally, he saw his home in the distance. It was the same wooden house standing on those tall stilts, looking exactly as it had the day he left. The large balcony still overlooked the calm water of the canal. The sight of it filled Mock with an overwhelming sense of relief. He began excitedly calling out his wife's name as he neared the small wooden dock in front of the house. He tied up the boat with trembling hands, fully expecting the front door to fly open and to see Maynok come running out with their baby in her arms. He imagined her face lighting up with recognition, the tears of joy that would fill her eyes when she realized that her husband had actually survived the war and come back to her. He had replayed this reunion in his mind thousands of times while lying in his hospital bed, and now that it was actually happening, his heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his chest. He scrambled out of the boat, his bare feet hitting the slick wooden planks of the dock, and took a step forward. His eyes locked on the front door, but she did not. 1 second passed, then 2, and still the wooden dock was silent. No one came out. The house was completely quiet. The only sound was the gentle rustling of the leaves in the wind. At this point, a horrible, sickening feeling washed over Mock. He stood on the dock, frozen, as the most terrible thoughts raced through his mind. Had something happened to her while he was away? Had she struggled during childbirth? In those days, many women did not survive labor, especially when they were all alone in isolated homes. How would he even know if she had passed away? But just as he was about to panic and run up the wooden stairs, he heard the creak of the heavy wooden door. The door slowly swung open and out stepped Maynok. She had a massive, radiant smile on her face, and wrapped tightly in her arms, clutched against her chest, was a small baby. Tears of pure joy began streaming down her face as she looked at her husband. Mock did not wait another second. He leapt out of his boat and ran up the stairs, throwing his arms around his wife and their new baby. The relief and happiness he felt in that moment was completely indescribable. Over the next few days, Mock felt like he had entered a state of absolute domestic bliss. He rolled over in bed each morning and saw his beautiful wife sleeping peacefully beside him. Right next to the bed, their baby boy slept soundly in a small hammock made of woven cloth. Mock had secretly hoped for a son, and finding out that he had a healthy baby boy was like a dream come true. Since his return, Mock had not left the house a single time. He was so incredibly grateful to be back with his family that he wanted nothing more than to just stay inside and enjoy their company. Maynok was incredibly attentive. She listened with wide eyes as Mock recounted his intense experiences in the war, and she went out of her way to cook all of his favorite traditional meals every single day. It was the perfect homecoming, but on the 4th morning after his return, Mock realized they had a practical problem. Their kitchen was almost completely empty. They had run out of fresh food, rice, and basic necessities. Mock knew that he would have to leave the house to go to the local market in the village center to buy supplies. So, as quietly as he could, Mock climbed out of bed. He did not want to wake his sleeping wife or the baby. He slowly got dressed and prepared to leave. But just as he was about to slip out the front door, he decided to walk back over to the bed to let Maynok know where he was going. He leaned down and gently whispered to her that he was heading to the market and would be back soon. Mock expected her to just nod sleepily and tell him to be careful. But the moment the words left his mouth, Maynok's eyes snapped wide open. She looked absolutely terrified, almost panicked. She suddenly sat upright in bed, reached out with a surprisingly strong grip, and grabbed Mock's arm. She actually shouted the word no so loudly that it echoed through the quiet house and instantly woke up the baby. The baby began crying loudly in his hammock, but Maynok did not pay any attention to him. She just stared at Mock with wide, desperate eyes. Mock was completely confused. He looked at his wife and asked her what was wrong and why she was reacting this way to a simple trip to the market. Maynok just kept shaking her head, holding onto his arm tightly, repeating over and over again that he could not leave the house. She looked away for a moment, as if she was struggling to find the right words to explain her panic. Then she looked back at him, her expression softening slightly, and explained that he had been gone for so long in the war that she simply could not bear the thought of him leaving her sight again. She begged him to just stay home with her and their son. She told him that she had a terrible feeling that if he left the house, something bad would happen and they would be separated forever. When Mock heard this, he was actually quite touched. He figured that her intense reaction was just a result of the trauma of him being gone for a year. It made sense to him that she would be highly protective and anxious about losing him again. He smiled warmly, gave her a reassuring hug and a kiss, and told her that he was only going to be gone for a little while. He explained that someone had to get food for the family and that he would be back as quickly as possible. Despite the look of deep dread on her face, Mock let go of her hand, turned, and walked out the door. A little while later, Mock arrived at the fruit stand in the village market. The market was located in the center of the community, which was a few miles away from his isolated home. Mock had walked the entire distance as fast as he could, keeping his promise to his wife that he would return quickly. When Mock approached the fruit stand to select some items, the owner of the stand looked up and saw him. The owner was a man from the village who had known Mock before he left for the war. But the moment the owner recognized Mock, his face went completely pale. He looked genuinely shocked, and then his expression quickly turned into one of deep sympathy. The owner looked at Mock, hesitated for a moment, and then asked him in a very quiet, tentative voice how he was doing. The owner was a middle-aged man with graying hair who had run this particular fruit stand in the village center for as long as Mock could remember. He had always been a cheerful, talkative man who loved to share the latest local gossip with anyone who stopped by to buy his products. But on this morning, he seemed completely stripped of his usual energetic personality. He was slowly wiping his hands on a dirty cotton cloth, staring at Mock with a look that was a mixture of absolute disbelief and deep, heavy sorrow. It was the kind of look a person gives you when they know some terrible, tragic secret that they are terrified to say out loud. Now, Mock did not think much of this at first. Praanong was a very small, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was common knowledge that Mock had been drafted and sent to the front lines of the war. Mock assumed the owner was simply expressing sympathy for the difficult things he must have experienced while fighting. Mock smiled and told the owner that the war had indeed been terrible and that he had been seriously injured. But then Mock proudly added that he was finally back home and that he was incredibly happy to be reunited with his wife and his brand new baby boy. He talked about how wonderful it was to have a son and how perfect his life was now that he was back, but as Mock was talking, the fruit stand owner's face did not break into a congratulatory smile. Instead, he looked even more confused and deeply unsettled. He stared at Mock for a few seconds before asking, in a very cautious tone, if his wife was really at home with him. Mock chuckled, finding the question a bit odd, and said that of course she was at home. He asked the owner where else she would possibly be. The fruit stand owner looked around nervously, avoiding Mock's eyes. He shook his head slowly and muttered that he must have heard some incorrect rumors, so he was just confused. Then, in a very awkward and abrupt manner, the owner changed the subject and asked Mock what fruit he wanted to buy. Mock bought his supplies, but the strange interaction left him feeling highly uneasy. Later that morning, Mock walked back to his house carrying several heavy bags of groceries. As he approached the property from the forest path, he looked up and saw Praanong out on the wooden balcony. She was holding their baby on her hip, feeding him. But from a distance, Mock noticed that she looked incredibly distant. She was staring blankly off into the forest, completely motionless, as if she was in some kind of deep trance. Mock called out her name, and the sound of his voice seemed to instantly snap her back to reality. She gasped slightly, looked down at him, and her face immediately lit up with that same beautiful, radiant smile. She quickly carried the baby inside the house, and by the time Mock walked through the front door, she was waiting for him in the kitchen. She seemed incredibly relieved to see him, hovering over him as he unpacked the food. It was as if she had been terrified that something terrible had happened to him during his brief absence. Mock was happy to see her so affectionate, but he could not stop thinking about the strange behavior of the fruit stand owner. As he put the rice and fruit away, Mock decided to mention the conversation to his wife. He told her how the owner had looked at him with sympathy and had seemed shocked and confused when Mock mentioned that his wife was at home with him. The moment Mock finished explaining this, Praanong's entire demeanor changed. Her warm smile vanished and her eyes filled with intense anger. She slammed a wooden bowl down on the table and told Mock that this was exactly why she had begged him not to leave the house. She explained that ever since he had been drafted and sent to the war, the people in the village had been incredibly cruel to her. She claimed that they had been talking about her constantly behind her back, spreading all kinds of horrible, vicious rumors about her and her baby. She said the villagers were untrustworthy and mean-spirited, and that they were trying to destroy their happiness. Mock was taken aback by her anger. He asked her what kind of rumors the villagers were spreading, wanting to understand what was going on. But Praanong refused to give him any details. She just angrily shook her head, tears of frustration welling in her eyes, and stormed out of the kitchen onto the balcony, leaving Mock alone with his thoughts. A couple of days passed, and the incident was not brought up again. Mock spent his time doing chores around the property, trying to get their life back to normal. But he could not help but notice that his wife's behavior was becoming increasingly strange. Before Mock had left for the war, Maynok had always been a very practical, logical, and independent woman. She was not the type to get easily upset by gossip or to cling to him constantly. But now, she seemed completely paranoid. She would not let him out of her sight for even a few minutes without crying or begging him to stay. On this particular morning, Mock needed to go out into the surrounding forest to chop down some trees for firewood. When he told Maynok his plans, she immediately burst into tears, wrapping her arms around his waist and sobbing hysterically, begging him not to go into the forest. It took Mock over 30 minutes of gentle reassurance and comforting words to finally calm her down and convince her to let him go. He explained that they desperately needed the wood for cooking and heating, and that he would only be a short distance from the house. As Mock walked into the dense forest with his heavy iron axe, he felt deeply troubled. He tried to rationalize her behavior. He told himself that she had spent a year completely alone in an isolated house, pregnant, giving birth with no support, and constantly fearing that her husband would die in battle. He figured that kind of prolonged isolation and extreme stress would take a massive psychological toll on anyone. He hoped that with enough time, love, and stability, she would slowly heal and return to her normal self. With a heavy sigh, Mock found a suitable dead tree and began swinging his axe. The steady, rhythmic thud of the metal blade hitting the thick wood echoed through the quiet forest. He worked for quite some time, focusing on the physical labor to clear his mind. But then, right in the middle of a swing, Mock heard the distinct sound of dry leaves and twigs crunching behind him. Someone was walking through the brush, heading directly towards him. Mock stopped his swing, lowered his axe, and turned around. At first, he assumed his anxious wife had ignored his requests and followed him into the woods. But as the figure stepped out from behind a thick patch of bamboo, Mock was surprised to see an elderly man. The man was wearing a long, traditional saffron-colored robe. Mock realized immediately that this man was a Buddhist monk from the local temple in the village center. This was not a stranger. The monk was a highly respected community elder whom Mock had seen many times before he left for the war. Mock felt a sense of relief, thinking the monk had heard about his return from the war and had walked out to their isolated property to welcome him home and offer a blessing. Mock smiled warmly, raised his hands in a respectful greeting, and began to speak, but the monk did not smile back. His face was etched with deep concern and anxiety. He walked quickly up to Mock, stopping just a couple of feet away. He leaned in close and began looking around the surrounding trees in a very paranoid, hypervigilant way, as if he was terrified that someone was watching them. In a very low, urgent whisper, the monk asked Mock if he was completely alone in the forest. Mock was thoroughly confused and a bit unsettled by the monk's strange behavior. He nodded slowly and told the monk that yes, he was entirely alone and that his wife was back at the house with the baby. At this, the monk seemed to relax just a fraction, but his expression remained deadly serious. He looked Mock directly in the eyes and told him that he had walked all the way out here because he desperately needed to tell him the truth about his wife. Mock's posture stiffened. He asked the monk what he was talking about. The monk explained that while Mock had been away at war, Maynok had changed completely. He claimed that she had become deeply paranoid, believing that the entire village was plotting against her. But then, the monk said something that completely shocked Mock. He said that Maynok had not just been upset by rumors. She had actually begun entering the village at night, terrorizing the residents and threatening anyone who spoke about her. He said the entire community was living in absolute fear of her. The monk stepped back, looking at Mock with an expectant expression, as if he expected Mock to apologize for his wife's terrifying behavior or offer some kind of explanation. But to Mock, this information made absolutely no sense. He knew his wife was acting a bit strange and anxious, and he knew she was upset about rumor. But the idea that she was sneaking into the village at night and terrorizing people was completely impossible. Since Mock had returned, he had been with her every single second of every day. They slept in the same bed, ate every meal together, and she had never left the house. He would have known if she was leaving in the middle of the night. Mock felt a surge of anger. He told the monk, as politely as he could muster, that he must be mistaken. He explained that his wife was at home with him, caring for their baby, and that there was simply no way she was terrorizing anyone in the village. But the monk shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and dread. He told Mock that he was completely wrong. He said that everyone in the village knew exactly what was wrong with his wife, and that Mock was the only person who was completely blind to the reality of the situation. Before Mock could say anything else, the monk said to him if he was smart, he would leave his wife right now and he would never look back. And when Mock heard this, he did not believe the monk. Instead, he actually realized that his wife must be telling the truth about how awful everybody was being, spreading these terrible rumors about her like she wasn't being paranoid at all. She had all the reason in the world to think people were out to get her or something. Mac dropped his polite demeanor entirely. He glared at the monk and told him to leave his property immediately and to never speak to him or his family again. Without waiting for a response, Mac gathered up his chopped firewood, turned his back on the monk, and began marching back to his house. The next morning, however, Mac found that he could not shake the conversation from his mind. Despite his anger, the sheer bizarre nature of the warnings was deeply disturbing. He realized that as long as these rumors persisted, his family would never have peace. He wanted to protect his wife, but to do that, he needed to know exactly what these rumors were and where they were coming from. He decided that he could not ask Maynok about it, as it would only cause her to spiral into another fit of anger and tears. The only logical option was to go back to the village and confront someone who might actually give him straight answers. He thought of the fruit stand owner. The owner had looked at him with such intense sympathy and confusion. He clearly knew the details of whatever story was circulating. So, before the sun had even risen, Mac quietly climbed out of bed, making sure not to make a sound. He slipped out of the house into the cool, misty morning and began walking quickly toward the village market. When he arrived at the market, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dusty ground. A few vendors were setting up their wooden displays, unloading heavy crates of fresh vegetables and lighting small oil lamps to cut through the dim morning light. Mac walked directly to the spot where the fruit stand was usually located, his boots crunching softly on the gravelly path. But when he got there, the space was completely empty. There were no crates of fruit, no table, and no sign of the owner. Mac stood there, looking at the empty spot, and a strange, cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He could not explain why, but the empty stand felt incredibly ominous. He did not want to wait around for hours to see if the owner would show up later. He decided he would walk to the owner's house. Because Praanong was so small, Mac knew exactly where the man lived. Mac left the market and jogged down the dirt path leading to the owner's home. It was a modest wooden house built on stilts, situated a short distance away from the main canal. When Mac arrived, the property was completely still. No smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney, and there was no sound of activity. Mac climbed up the wooden ladder to the front porch and knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, calling out the owner's name. But the only response was the wind blowing through the nearby trees. Mac leaned forward and pressed his ear against the wooden door, listening intently. The interior of the house was dead silent. The feeling of dread in Mac's stomach was now overwhelming. He felt certain that something was terribly wrong. Unable to help himself, he reached down, grabbed the simple wooden latch on the door, and pushed. The door was unlocked. It swung slowly inward, revealing the dark, shadowed interior of the home. The absolute second the door opened, a horrific, overpowering stench blasted out of the house. It was a smell that Mac recognized instantly from his time on the battlefields of the war. It was the rancid, unmistakable smell of decaying flesh. Mac gagged, quickly covering his nose and mouth with his hand. He hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming at him to turn around and run. But he had to know what was inside. He stepped into the dark room, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. He called out the owner's name one more time, his voice trembling. There was no movement. As Mac walked further into the room, he looked down at the floorboards. In the center of the main living area, he saw a large, dark pool of liquid. He stepped closer and realized with horror that it was a massive pool of dried, dark blood, and lying right in the middle of that pool of blood was the body of the fruit stand owner. He was lying on his back, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. His body was covered in deep, horrific wounds, and it was clear that he had been dead for at least a day or two. The wounds looked as though they had been inflicted by something incredibly powerful and sharp, tearing through his clothing and flesh with raw, primal fury. Mac's heart hammered violently against his ribs. He felt a wave of sheer panic wash over him. He did not look at the body any longer. He turned, sprinted out of the house, scrambled down the wooden ladder, and began running away as fast as his legs could carry him. As he ran through the forest path, his mind was in a complete frenzy. He knew that the logical, correct thing to do was to run to the village center, find the local authorities or the monks, and report the murder. But a terrifying thought held him back. He remembered the monks' warnings from the day before. He remembered the fruit stand owner's shocked reaction to hearing that Maynok was alive and well. Mac realized that if he reported this murder, the villagers, who already harbored some kind of deep, inexplicable hatred and fear of his wife, would instantly accuse her of the crime. They would use this tragedy to destroy his family. So instead of running to the village, Mac made the desperate decision to run back to his own house. He wanted to get his wife and baby, pack their belongings, and leave Praanong forever. They could go to Bangkok or even further, where no one knew them and they could live in peace. As he neared his property, Mac forced himself to slow down. He took deep breaths, trying to stop his frantic shaking and catch his wind. He did not want to walk into the house looking terrified and alert his wife to the horror he had just discovered. He hoped that she and the baby were still asleep, allowing him to quietly prepare them to leave. But as he stepped out of the tree line and approached the clearing around his home, he looked up at the high wooden balcony that overlooked the canal. His heart sank. Maynok was already awake. She was standing on the edge of the balcony, holding the baby on her hip, looking out over the water. She did not see Mock approaching from the side of the property. Max stopped in his tracks, watching her. He was trying to figure out how he was going to break the news to her that they had to leave immediately. As he watched, Maynok reached out her free hand toward a branch of a lime tree that was growing close to the balcony. The branch had several ripe green limes hanging from it. She grabbed one of the limes, twisting it to pull it off the branch, but as she pulled the lime free, it slipped from her fingers. The round green fruit bounced off the wooden railing of the balcony, rolled across the floorboards, and slipped perfectly through one of the narrow gaps between the wooden slats. Because the house was built on tall stilts, the balcony floor was about 7 feet above the ground. Mock watched the lime fall through the gap and land on the dirt directly beneath the house. This was a completely mundane, insignificant event. Mock expected his wife to simply shrug, reach for another lime on the branch, and go about her morning, but she did not. Instead, Maynok did something that defied all laws of nature, something so deeply unnatural and horrific that it shattered Mock's reality in an instant. Without looking around and still unaware that Mock was watching her from the tree line, Maynok slowly knelt down on the balcony floor. She kept the baby balanced on her hip with one arm, and with her other arm, she reached down and slid her hand through the narrow gap in the floorboards. And then Mock watched in absolute paralyzed horror as his wife's arm began to stretch. It did not just reach down a little bit. The arm began to physically elongate, growing longer and longer, extending far beyond the length of a human limb. As the arm stretched downward toward the ground 7 feet below, Mock could hear a series of sickening, wet, crackling sounds like bones snapping and shifting under intense pressure. The arm continued to stretch, longer and longer, until her hand finally reached the dirt ground below the house. Her fingers wrapped around the fallen lime, and then, with another series of horrific crunching sounds, the elongated, unnaturally long arm began to retract, pulling the lime back up through the gap in the floorboards. Shrinking back to its normal human size, Maynok stood back up, holding the lime. And it was at that exact moment that she turned her head and looked directly at Mac standing in the trees. Her face was completely expressionless, her eyes cold and hollow. Mac did not scream. The sheer terror was so absolute that it froze the air in his lungs. He turned on his heel and ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his entire life, faster than he had ever run on the battlefields of the war. He did not look back. He did not think about his belongings. He only knew that he had to get as far away from that house and that entity as physically possible. He ran straight to the village center, heading directly to the Buddhist temple. He scrambled up the stone steps and began violently pounding on the heavy wooden doors, screaming for the monks to let him in, begging for protection. The doors opened, and several monks, seeing Mock's state of sheer hysterical terror, quickly pulled him inside and bolted the heavy doors behind him. For hours, Mock sat on the stone floor of the temple, his entire body shaking violently. He was completely incoherent, babbling about his wife's arm, about the lime, and about the dead body of the fruit stand owner. He was trying to convince himself that what he had seen was an illusion, a hallucination brought on by his war injuries or his lack of sleep. But deep down, he knew the truth. He knew what he had witnessed was real. The monks did not interrupt him. They let him weep and panic, offering him water and quiet prayers. But eventually, as the afternoon sun began to set, the elderly monk who had warned Mock in the forest walked over and sat down beside him on the floor. The monk looked at Mock with deep sadness and told him that it was time for him to hear the full, tragic truth about his family. But the monk explained that before he could tell him, Mock had to promise to do something incredibly difficult, something that would cause him immense emotional pain. The monk told Mock that they would need his permission to go to the village cemetery and exhume the body of his beloved wife. Mock, crying and desperate for answers, agreed, and so the monk sat back and explained the truth that the entire village of Praanong had been keeping from him. It turned out that several months after Mock had been drafted and sent to the war, Maynok had gone into labor. Because she lived in such an isolated home, far away from any neighbors, she was completely alone when the labor began. The childbirth was incredibly difficult. There were severe complications, and with no one there to help her, Maynok had tragically passed away during the labor. The baby boy she was trying to deliver had also died with her. Days later, a neighbor who had noticed a lack of activity at the house went to check on her and discovered the tragic scene. The villagers had gathered her body and the body of her stillborn son, carried them to the local cemetery, and buried them in the ground. But Maynok's love for Mock had been incredibly powerful, so powerful that it refused to accept the reality of her death. Her spirit remained bound to their home, waiting desperately for her husband to return from the war. When Mock finally did return, her ghost was able to manifest a physical form, creating an illusion of a living, breathing wife and a healthy baby boy. She had created a perfect, fabricated reality of domestic bliss because she could not bear the thought of Mok knowing she was gone, but the problem was the villagers knew she was dead. They had buried her. When they saw Mok returning to the house and living there as if nothing had happened, they were terrified. They realized that the woman Mok was living with was not a living human, but a ghost. Whenever anyone from the village tried to get close to the house to warn Mok, or whenever they spoke about her being dead, Maynok's spirit would become incredibly angry and vengeful. She was terrified that if Mok found out the truth, he would leave her and her illusion of happiness would be shattered. So her spirit began terrorizing the village, threatening anyone who dared to speak the truth. And the fruit stand owner, who had awkwardly tried to question Mok about his wife's presence, had paid the ultimate price. Maynok's vengeful spirit had gone to his home in the night and brutally murdered him to silence him. The monk explained that as long as her body remained in the ground and her spirit was allowed to roam, she would continue to hold Mok captive in this horrific false reality, and she would kill anyone else who tried to interfere. The very next day, Mok, accompanied by the village monks and a group of brave residents, went to the local cemetery. Mok stood by, tears streaming down his face as the men began digging up the grave of his wife. When they finally reached the coffin and opened it, Mok saw the tragic reality of what had happened. Inside the coffin was the skeletal remains of Maynok, and lying beside her was the tiny skeleton of their unborn son. The monks began chanting sacred Buddhist prayers, performing a ritual to release her spirit from her earthly remains and allow her to finally find peace. As part of the ritual, the head monk carefully carved out a small circular-shaped piece of Maynok's skull. This piece of bone was inscribed with sacred protective prayers, designed to bind her spirit and prevent her from ever manifesting in the physical world again to harm the living. Mac was devastated, but he knew it was the only way to save his own soul and to let his wife and child finally rest in peace. After the ritual was complete, the head monk gave the carved piece of Maynok's skull to Mok, telling him to keep it with him at all times as a talisman to protect him. Mok, heartbroken and forever changed by the experience, spent the rest of his days living a quiet, peaceful life. He eventually joined the priesthood himself, seeking solace in the teachings of the Buddha and praying every day for the souls of his departed wife and son. According to local lore, the sacred piece of her skull bone was passed down through generations, at one point even coming into the possession of the royal family, before eventually being lost to history. Today, in the modern district of Praanong in Bangkok, which was once the rural village of Praanong, there is a very famous and highly visited permanent shrine dedicated to Maynok, who is widely known as Maynok Praanong. The shrine is filled with colorful flowers, traditional dresses offered as gifts, and portraits of a beautiful young woman holding a baby. To some, Maynok is viewed as a terrifying, dangerous ghost who represents the ultimate horror of a vengeful spirit. But to many others, she is viewed with deep respect and sympathy, representing a symbol of a love so incredibly powerful and pure that it was able to transcend the boundaries of death itself. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.